for today. So as Nivea said, I'm not a lawyer, I'm an economist. So today what we'll be seeing, some statistics, some data and some statistics that we have for you. Today I wanted to share our experience in Trinidad and Tobago, particularly as TAT, and some of the fundamental steps that we are taking to help bridge the digital divide in Trinidad and Tobago. There we go. So on the agenda, I just want to summarize a bit on what we do at TADI Telecoms Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, the concept of universal service, and explain what that term means. And then I want to zero in on the digital divide and some of the initiatives that we are implementing at TAT to help bridge the digital divide. So in terms of TAT, who are we and what do we do? We are the Telecoms Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, and we are responsible for regulating both the telecoms and the broadcasting sector. And we are governed by our Telecoms Act, and the objects of our act are on screen: creating an open telecoms market with conditions for fair competition, ensuring the orderly development of telecoms, protecting and promoting the public interest, facilitating universal access to telecommunications, encouraging investors to come into our industry, and regulating the broadcasting sector. So on the fourth point in the previous slide, we looked at facilitating access to telecommunications. And this leads me to universal access. Within our Telecoms Act, Section 28 of our Telecoms Act talks about universal service. And from the Act, we developed our universal service framework and our universal service regulations. And the concept of universal service, it means having all of our citizens, everybody in the country, having access to basic telecom services. And when we talk about basic telecom services, we are looking at access to fixed and mobile voice services, access to the internet, access to directory inquiries, access to emergency services, and so on. So that's why we have universal service as being one of the very important objects of our Act. And there are three fundamental principles that comes under universal service, and that is ICT availability. That is, the service should be available to all inhabited parts of the country. We have ICT accessibility. All citizens can use the service regardless of location, regardless of gender, disabilities, and so on. And ICT affordability. Everybody, all citizens should be able to afford basic telecom services. And in order for us to meet our universal service obligations, we first need to measure and identify where the digital divide exists in our country. Because, as this slide says, it's a very famous quotation: what is not measured quickly becomes invisible, and what is invisible is lost, and what is lost cannot be acted on or remedied. So we have defined digital divide, we have defined it in our universal service framework as a gap that exists between those who have access to ICTs and those that do not. And this gap can exist in different forms. It can exist amongst your population groups. So for example, persons with disabilities, different age groups, persons of different economic status. It can exist amongst geographical areas. Different areas within your country may not have access to ICTs. And the digital divide can also exist within regions and within countries, because different countries are different aspects or progress differently when it comes to ICTs. And this is what I want, a key thing I wanted to touch on, and we have Sophie here from the ITU. Over the years, we have been measuring the digital divide, and we use this tool that is the ICT Development Index. This is a tool that has been developed by the ITU, and it is internationally recognized because at the end of the day, whichever tool we use to measure the digital divide, we need to ensure that it meets international standards and is comparable on an international basis. So this is a tool that we currently use, the IDI, and the IDI comprises of 11 main indicators, and they're divided into 3 different subgroups. The first subgroup being the access subindex, and there are 5 indicators under there. There is a usage subindex with 3 indicators, and the skill subindex with 3 additional indicators. So to measure the digital divide in Trinidad and Tobago, over the last couple of years, we started in 2021, we did a digital inclusion survey, and that survey lasted just about a year. And I just wanted to touch on the methodology that we used for the survey. It was a multi-stage survey, and we interviewed just about 6,000 households throughout Trinidad and Tobago. That's about 17,000 individuals who were interviewed, and that's of our population is around 1.3 million people. And the base document, the survey instrument that we used was a questionnaire that the ITU uses in order to collect ICT statistics. So that is what we used as our base question, and we built questions on top of that. And then we use the IDI at the end of the day to measure where we were in terms of a digital divide. And these are some of the results coming out of the digital inclusion survey. So the IDI ranges from 0 to 10. 10 meaning that there is no digital divide existing in your country. And this is where we were as at 2022. Trinidad and Tobago, we measured just about 7.86 on the IDI. And you would see on screen as well the different municipalities and communities within Trinidad and Tobago. So those to the right of the screen, on that side, those are communities that we consider underserved because they fall under the national IDI level. There we go. So in terms of the 3 different sub-indices that we just looked at, now this was not the first digital inclusion survey that we did. The first one we did was in 2007, and the second one we did was in 2013. So what we did was we measured how we have progressed in terms of the 3 different indicators, the 3 different sub-indices. And what we saw in terms of the access sub-index, we increased by 11%, which is okay. In the usage sub-index, we increased by about 13%, and in skill sub-index, this was incredible, we increased by about 78%. And I'll explain what that means in a couple of slides later down. This is some further statistics that came out of the survey. What it showed is that under infrastructure and access, in terms of mobile coverage, 100% of the country is covered by 3G. Just about 75%, it's probably a bit more, or probably closer to 80%, is covered by 4G, and this is according to the data that we would have collected from our service providers. In terms of phone ownership, just about 84% of the population owns a mobile phone. And these are some very interesting statistics now. Out of that 84%, 85% are female and 83% are male. And that's good news for us because it means in terms of gender equality, men and women seem to be on almost the same level in ICTs. Some other statistics coming out of the survey. What the data showed is that 81% of households in Trinidad and Tobago had access to the internet. What it also showed is that 60% of households have access to a computer now. We found this figure quite low. 60% have access to a computer, and what we realized, I had mentioned that we had used the ITU-based questionnaire for the survey. The term computer that's defined under the indicators, it does not include smartphones and mobile phones and so on. So this 60% does not include those devices, just strictly computers like this, the laptop, and that's why that figure looks a bit low. But as you all know, some persons, a smartphone actually is a substitute for a computer in most cases. You go online with it, you can do classes online with it. So we think this figure is a bit higher than it actually is. In terms of households with internet access at home, so we saw that 81% of households actually had access, but 79% of those households were in rural areas and 83% were in urban areas in Trinidad and Tobago. In terms of mobile and fixed telephone subscriptions, so our mobile subscription is just about 145, meaning most persons have more than one phone. In terms of fixed telephony, 71% of households in Trinidad and Tobago actually have a fixed telephone subscription, which we found was very high because mobile phones have now become a substitute for fixed lines, and we find persons are giving up their fixed lines, but it's at 71% as at the end of last year. In terms of active mobile broadband subscriptions, 58 out of every 100 inhabitants had an active mobile broadband subscription, so mostly a postpaid phone. For fixed broadband subscriptions, 90 out of every 100 persons actually had a fixed broadband subscription. And if we delve a little deeper into the fixed broadband subscription, so that amounts to around 377,600 persons subscribing to fixed broadband services. The majority of those subscriptions were greater than 10 meg. Actually, when we, from the data we collected from the service providers last year, more than 80% of the subscriptions were over 100 megs per second. So this data is a bit outdated, but 100 megs for small islands, I think that's fantastic in terms of statistics. In terms of individuals using the internet, 79% of the population actually uses the internet. And again, some good statistics for us. 82% of that 79% were females, 76% were males. And what we also found is that the majority of users were within the category of 15 to 24 years old. Prices, what we saw when it came to prices. Our mobile and internet packages account for just about 2% of consumers' GNI per capita, and that is, I believe, within the acceptable standards for the ITU as being considered affordable basic telecom services. For skills, what we saw is that 73% of individuals had basic telecom skills, but just 4% of individuals had advanced telecom skills. And when we talk about advanced telecom skills, we're talking about being able to do programming and that type of IT work. So how can we use the results that came out of this survey to help bridge the digital divide? What we have done, we have used this data and we have come up with universal service projects, universal service initiatives. And one of the main initiatives that we have, it's called a TT Wi-Fi project. This is a government initiative to allow the general public to access free quality broadband internet to be productive while they wait at public locations. So we have rolled out Wi-Fi services to all public libraries within Trinidad and Tobago, to all schools without connectivity, so that's all primary and secondary level schools, the different transportation hubs around the country, and the public waiting areas and health institutions. So hospitals and health centers and so on also have access to the TT Wi-Fi service. One of the other initiatives we have rolled out for universal service is the Persons with Disabilities Initiative. And this seeks to promote digital inclusion for persons with disabilities in Trinidad and Tobago. It was launched just about 3 years ago. And the goal is to provide subsidized mobile handsets containing assistive technologies to persons who are visually and or hearing impaired or have a disability and is in receipt of a disability use grant from our Ministry of Social Development. We are hoping to expand this project a bit and roll it out not only just to those who are visually and hearing impaired, but to all persons who have a disability. In terms of infrastructure projects, we are rolling out ICT access centers throughout the country. The latest ones are going to be in Tobago. That's where we are focusing on this year. And we are also rolling out infrastructure projects to areas that are considered underserved. So we actually have contractual obligations with our service providers to roll out infrastructure in areas like Barbados and so on in Trinidad and Tobago. So, Mr. Khan, that's, I'm sure I'm within time. That's the end of my That's the end of my presentation. Please visit our website. The Digital Inclusion Report is published on our website. Some of the data that I showed within the presentation is contained within our market reports. We publish annual and quarterly market reports with data that we collect from the service providers. So that brings me to the end. I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
I just wanted quickly to mention, Annie, for those who don't know, that TAT there's not a goodie bag, but they collect revenues from concessionaires and licensees of ICT sector, and coming out of those fees, they apportion a little bit to the Universal Service Fund. So I just wanted to just beef up that little point for them so that you know where the $600 coming from and the Wi-Fi rollout of the buildings. Yeah, good.
Yeah, so actually it's about 1% of the revenues that the service providers make for the year that is contributed towards universal service. Right now it's just for the telecom operators. Soon we are hoping to have our act amended so that fees can be collected from our broadcasters as well. So we can actually start rolling out broadcast universal service initiatives in Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you, Navia.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions? I see that I have a question submitted from our online participants. It's from Monique Clements. I think we all know Monique. She's on the Ministry of Digital Transformation, I believe, in Trinidad. Beyond the restricted definition of computer, what are the limitations and or variation in the indicators should be taken into consideration from the last period just before this survey for more accurate analysis when using these findings?
That's a very good question. At the ITU, they are currently revising some of the definitions that are contained within the indicators handbook. They're actually revising the IDI indicator, the IDI index as well. In terms of computer, we found the definition just a bit restrictive, especially with what happened with the pandemic. A lot of persons, they didn't have access to laptops, but persons had access to a mobile phone. They had access to tablets and so on that acted just as good as a computer to get online, to do classes, to access banking services online and so on. So in revising the ITU definition of computer, that's one of the things we want to consider, expanding the definition to not only include computers, but not only laptops, but tablets and smartphones and smart devices and so on.
Actually, sorry, just one question as well. Thank you. Rodney Taylor. The ITU has an initiative by 2030 to connect the unconnected globally. Is there any such targets with Trinidad and Tobago to connect those unconnected communities and individuals, number one? And number two, what flexibility do you have on the USF? So besides bringing the connectivity to the home or to the community, specifically on other things that would provide meaningful connectivity. So even the devices, for example, and also the digital skills, basic knowledge and how to use the technology tools. Is that within the scope of the USF?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Currently, it isn't. But what we realized is that while the legislation, when the regulations were drafted, there were things that it was at that point in time. Things happened. The pandemic happened. While the regulations didn't allow us. I'll give an example. We purchased 10,000 tablets to give out to schools around the country because there were students who were underprivileged and did not have access. any way to get online to do online classes. So we purchased 10,000 tablets, and it was through the Universal Service Fund. And while the regulations, it's not clear in the regulations that we can use the regulations to do that. We saw it as an initiative. At the end of the day, we said the definition of universal services, every citizen of Trinidad and Tobago should have access to basic telecom services. And we believe these tablets were an instrument to help persons reach that objective. So we did that initiative, and Nivea mentioned it was the Universal Service Fund which funded it through the USF, and we actually asked our service providers, Digicel and B-Mobile, to purchase the tablets for us. So the monies went back to those service providers and purchasing the tablets, and then we gave it to the Ministry of Education. Ashley, just remind me of the first question again. Right. So within the Ministry of Digital Transformation, we do have the National ICT Plan, and I think it's currently being redrafted. And I do believe there are specific targets within that plan. From those targets, we also do a strategic plan for that, and we will be including some of those targets so that we can help connect the unconnected and meet the obligations of the UN.
I see there's another question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Annie, for a very comprehensive presentation there. I noticed the penetration for the computers in the homes, which is around 60%, I think.
Yeah.
Which we did a similar survey in St. Vincent and the Grenadines about 2 years ago, and we had similar numbers. And I was trying to find like the root cause of it, which I think maybe goes back to maybe affordability, which you look at more like laptops, computers, which are more expensive than a smartphone, and which we believe is needed, especially for certain things, doing schoolwork, university learning. It's a lot better to do it on a computer than a smartphone. Right. I also saw where you use the criteria from the ITU to do the survey, and the way where you reference the affordability within the GNI percentage, you think you're within that. But I was wondering, I don't think I ever saw a criteria for device affordability. We see it for broadband, I think, like the cost of broadband, and they give you the GNI, it should be within to get it. But I don't think there's one for devices, if you follow me. Because years ago, if you had a fixed line, you get a fixed line with a telephone together, you get the whole package. Yes. But when you get the internet now, broadband, you can't work unless you get the computer. But we seem to spend a lot of attention to the actual cost of the broadband, but not the device to go with the broadband. Yeah. So I don't know if there actually is an index to measure that affordability, especially for developing countries like in the Caribbean. We did some work recently. If you compare it, I made up one for myself, and a kind of affordability index, and look at the numbers like in the USA, and there's a big difference. Yeah. As compared to the devices in the Caribbean. Yeah. So I don't know if there's actually one ITU use or if something we should look at to help us when we're doing this whole trying to bridge the digital divide.
Apollo, that's a very good question. Within the IDI, it doesn't look at the affordability of devices like computers. And you're right, the cost of it is much higher than a smartphone and so on, and that's possibly why the figures were reading so low in our countries. If you have a look at our digital inclusion report, within a report, aside from measuring the IDI, we also came up with another index. We call it the Digital Inclusion Index. It's an index we created on our own. We looked at the different indices that the UN had to come up with a more inclusive type index. I want to put it like that because it measures affordability to a greater extent. Within that index, please have a look at our digital inclusion report and see how it is we came up with those indicators within the report. And in terms, so not just in terms of affording the services themselves, but affording the devices, your laptops, your cell phones, and so on. Currently, our universal service regulation speaks to telecom services. So it hasn't been expanded yet to accommodate devices. And that's one of the things we're looking at in terms of amending our regulations to have it accommodate both services as well as devices that can support those services.
Okay, we have one final You all want to collaborate and split your question in half? Okay, we'll just take these two final questions because we want to keep on time. And we do have a very dynamic presentation to top of the day on cyber scandals and espionage, and we don't want to miss out on that. So you can go ahead first, and then the gentleman in back.
Thank you. I'm Simon Joseph Oliver from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. My question refers to the results or the stats you got from the survey with ICT skills. I noticed for the basic skills, you have a decent number, 73%, but for the standard and the advanced skills, they're a bit low. So now that you have the data, is there any plan in place to find solutions or things that can be done in order to improve the skills of the citizens? And one of the reasons why I'm asking is because for us, we are currently going through the digital transformation process, and we are actually working on that gap, that market assessment we just did recently in terms of finding out where the gaps are with our skills. So I want to know if there is something that you would have done or plan to do that we can learn from that and apply it to us in St. Vincent.
Very good question as well. So 4%, that's where we were in terms of persons, the population having advanced ICT skills, and that was a red flag for us. So what we have done, again, in the digital inclusion report, we have identified projects that we can work on to help raise that figure. One of the projects will be with our line ministry, the Ministry of Digital Transformation, to help roll out programs to persons within the country. And one of the ways we can do it, I had mentioned we are doing some infrastructure type projects. For example, our ICT access centers, we can actually use those centers to host workshops to educate persons and help raise that level of skills within Trinidad and Tobago. So that's just one of the means we are using to try and help increase our advanced skills index.
All right, and we have one final question for you, Annie.
Actually, it was a similar question, very similar. So we did actually split it. I'm Rodney Payne. I'm the project manager for the Public Sector Modernization Program, and it was about improving the digital skills of the populace, as well as I just wanted to understand more about the infrastructures, how that was being rolled out, and what were the real objectives of it, and how it was being funded.
Right. So the infrastructure type projects are being funded through our USF as well. Our universal service regulations talk about two types of projects: mandatory universal service initiatives and what we call contractual universal service initiatives. And that's where our infrastructure projects fall under the contractual obligations. So what we do, we draft an RFP with what infrastructure we are looking at rolling out, and we allow the service providers to bid for those infrastructure projects. So we use what we call a reverse auction process, and whoever comes in with the lowest bid but meets all of the criteria we have within the RFP, we then allocate them the project. So that's one of the ways we are rolling out the infrastructure projects. In terms of the skills as well, I forgot to mention, what we tend to do, every year we celebrate Girls in ICTs Day and World Telecoms Information Day. And we try to help improve the skills within the country. So last year, what we did, we partnered with our national libraries, we partnered with NALIS, and we launched a series of programs online where we taught persons how to do different skills on their phone, how to use your phone to do this, how to access apps on your phone, how to download apps and those type of things. So we actually create programs to help build basic skills, and a lot of the elderly within our population, they were able to access these videos and they benefited a lot from it. Yeah. Did I answer your question on the infrastructure though, or was there another part of it? Yeah. We do have published on our website as well our universal service initiatives, and there's a section that talks about our infrastructure projects. There's a lot of detail within that report that talks about how we actually roll out the infrastructure projects in the country. And it's on our website. at tat.org.tt.
Vashti, if you permit me 1 second, just to really re-emphasize a quick point, and that is that I think this avenue of the USF is underestimated by many countries in the Caribbean. Many countries have resource limitation and challenges, and unfortunately do not have a universal service fund, obligation, legislation, etc., to support some of the new things we are talking about. I think the model that we hear from Trinidad here is a perfect example that if we talk about one Caribbean, and CARICOM would be useful because governments are asking for help financially. And this we hear for rural community connectivity, transport, public service, etc. Annie, I don't know if you have a dollar figure that you can probably share for what your funds would have been in utilizing for which the country benefit or users benefit over the probably last 3 years. I see your friends saying no, but I think it's plenty money. Yes, you want to probably share how much millions it had been. Over to you. Sorry for that, Vashti, but I think it's important.
Actually, I think before Annie answers that, your colleague Sophie would also like to add to what you're saying, if that's okay.
Yes, to supplement Cleveland's point, and Annie will have a flashback to 10 years ago when we were doing the universal service regulations within the HIPCAR project. And she will remember that I feel very strongly, I agree with Cleveland, Universal Service Fund is an important tool and mechanism, but don't stare yourself blind on the Universal Service Fund, because what Annie put forward was you need to look at it holistically. So you really need to look at the universal service financing within a context. And that context is measure the gap, do the homework, measure the gap, and then have the tools that can include pay or play, that can include other financing mechanisms. I would like to put out there that we've just released our Universal Service Financing Toolkit, and we also have capacity building and training that's just become available. But the fund is important, but as I said, don't stare yourself blind just on the fund. Look at the financing, look at partners that can help you finance that gap. Because when we're talking about digital, when we're talking about bringing into connectivity into other sectors, into other public areas, it's about collaboration with the other sectors as well. So look at it as universal service financing within a holistic strategy, and part of that is the fund, but it's not just the fund. I just wanted to add that. Sorry, Cleveland.
Sophie, that's a very good point. And just banking on what Cleveland just said, Cleveland, I can't recall offhand just how much we spent on our universal service projects thus far, but we do have a report published on our website. It's the accounting report that we publish for the Universal Service Fund, and the monies that we spend, how much we collect, and how much we spend. It's contained within that report because we want to be as transparent as possible. Those service providers that contribute towards the fund, we want them to see where the monies are going. And just to add as well, so while we do collect just around 1% of the revenues from our telecom service providers to go into the fund, a lot of the funding also comes from us, from TAT, because we do collect concession and license fees from our service providers. A portion of it goes towards our operating costs, and a portion of it, whatever excess there is surplus, goes towards our consolidated fund for the government. And we take a percentage, a portion of that fund, and of the consolidated fund, the amounts that's allocated to the consolidated fund, and put it into our USF. And that is what funds a lot of our universal service projects. So it's not just contributions from our service providers, but from us financing the fund as well.
Thank you very much, Annie.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Annie. 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 Thank you very much, An